and welcome to the third episode of our China under Trump series. Today we will be discussing security and international relations. And to go through this topic with me today, I'm joined by Kerry Brown, Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London. So thank you very much for joining us, Kerry.
Thank you.
So first off, I would argue that one of the key topics in this sphere is probably the South China Sea, which obviously has seen China start building these artificial islands to claim ownership of this body of water, essentially. And when it comes to the U.S. reaction to this in the last few months, we saw Rex Tillerson, which is the nominee for the Secretary of State, come out and say that he would want to bar China from these islands, and of course that caused a lot of uproar in the mainland. I mean, where do we stand right now in terms of these kinds of statements? I mean, was a conflict in the South China Sea ever a possibility between US and China?
A conflict is a possibility through mistake. The Chinese claims are extensive. They go right down to the edge of Malaysia, so that's 2,000 kilometers into the sea. And of course, there are lots and lots of contesting partners, particularly Vietnam, that they've also built something like 40 sort of, kind of modifications to islands, whatever you call these things. So it's a very, very kind of febrile atmosphere. I mean, I think China's still got the same strategy. It wants more strategic space around it. It feels like the world's second biggest economy, and its logistic lines are sort of vulnerable. A lot of energy comes to it via the South China Sea. And it's sort of demeaning that this great power should have this restriction on it. So I think that that hasn't changed. Whether the Tillerson threat of actually stopping China getting onto its islands will ever happen, I mean, that would be very difficult, because you'd nearly, you wouldn't be just defending logistic lines, you'd be actually having to stop actions by the Chinese. So it would be a kind of an act of war. So I think it's mostly the rhetoric. The rhetoric has got more intense now. Whether there will be events that would provoke an escalation, it's hard to say. It's possible, and in fact it's more possible now than it was 2 or 3 months ago.
And in terms of, in light of the phone call, let's say that President Trump and President Xi Jinping have had, Trump has finally, recognized the One China policy. I mean, does that change in any way the discourse around the South China Sea question, do you think?
Well, I think it means that almost immediately you've got a game where China is one up. I mean, after all this tough language about One China, basically, and the non-recognition of it or the questioning of it, Trump has backed down. I mean, that's the honesty. And so you've got a kind of, beginning where I think the Chinese have already started to read Trump and realize whatever deal he wants to do, it's not going to be about these geopolitical issues, it's going to be about the economy. China and the United States, no matter who is in charge, unless you're totally suicidal, can't walk away from each other. I mean, they have $600 billion of trade a year. A lot of that is in China's favor, but you wouldn't get the cheap goods going into America without China producing them. So all of this rhetoric at the beginning of the presidency, it doesn't really matter. I think at the end of the day, the two have to work with each other. And the fact that the North Koreans have just fired a missile this weekend shows the security issues too haven't changed. The threats are still in the same place, even though the language has been slightly different for Trump at the beginning of his presidency.
And in terms of the dynamic between the two countries, we've seen, when we look at, let's say, the trade and investment side of things, we talked about this before. You argue that, for instance, China would be very happy to step in for the U.S., especially in the Asia-Pacific. And now that the U.S. has stepped away from the TPP, China would definitely be keen to solidify its relationships even more in the region. But when it comes to security, in terms of stepping in for the U.S., if the U.S. were to back away more in the future, that probably is not as obvious. What do you think about this?
Well, I think China knows that there's a huge political and financial price tag for getting involved in security in the region, and it's tended to be a bit parasitical to just accept the American kind of hegemony there in a way, but pick away at it in areas where it didn't suit it. And I think that it now sees this possible vacuum coming and doesn't feel comfortable. I mean, it wants to be the dominant region. It wants to be the dominant regional player. I don't think anyone doubts that. But it doesn't want to be this police person who goes around and has to sort out issues that aren't directly related to it. That's a huge kind of step forward that it would have to take to do that. So I think it must feel pretty ambiguous about America backing away. On the one hand, it sees space that it can fill, and if it suits it, it'll fill it. But in other ways, it'll see all sorts of things that it'll get dragged into that it doesn't want to. So this is, I think, an uncomfortable moment for China. It doesn't really want this big responsibility.
The opportunity cost would be too high. In terms of another dynamic that we've seen changing, I guess, somewhat since Trump has stepped into the White House, you could argue that since his administration has come in, we've seen it have quite maybe more antagonistic rapport with some of the most historical allies of the US, like, I don't know, Germany or Australia, whereas a historical foe almost in Russia, Trump has actually been a bit more amicable than past administrations. If there were to be a rapprochement of sorts between the US and Russia, where do you think that would leave China?
Well, trilateralism has always been 2 against 1. So in 1972, it was America using a weak China in order to attack a strong Russia, or USSR as existed then. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was something like this now, where a weak Russia was being used to put pressure on a strong China. I mean, a lot of the kind of narratives of the Trump presidency are about dealing with China and putting it in its place underneath all of the friendliness. I mean, that's the sort of, I think, the idea economically and politically to put China in its place. And so I think all of this sort of Trump's desire to be friendly to Russia, I don't think that the Russians will be super relaxed about that. You know, there's one thing worse than an American's hate, and it's their love. And, you know, this is going to probably bury Russia. And I think China would be very, very suspicious of any links between America and Russia. They think it was more containment. At the end of the day, though, Russia and China's relations are pragmatic. They're not really that warm. They're not strategic. They're competitors. The Belt Road Initiative runs right into the Central Asian region, which is Russia's area of interest. China is 15 times bigger as an economy than Russia. In a sense, our geopolitical map is a bit odd because we give Russia this prominence, but China is really the main player. Russia is, you know, quite a small player economically, not really that important.
Well, Kerry, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you very much.